another webinar in our webinar series. We offer these periodically, typically 4 to 6 times a year. We do a free webinar on a variety of topics. Right now, we're focused on some topics we asked about on our social media platform at the end of last year, what people wanted to hear most about. And one of the topics that came out of that was some ergonomic training. So I focused some conversation around training today, highlighting some different ideas and thoughts on how you might deliver some really exceptional training and how to make it really sustainable and get the most out of the training that you possibly can. And so that's where my goal or focus has been today. We will have another webinar coming up. I do not have it yet scheduled. I would anticipate it will be at the end of June or early July, and we'll keep you posted. If you follow us on social media, you'll see it there. You'll also get it if you're on our mailing list. You'll also get announcements about our upcoming webinars that way as well. And obviously, it'll be on our website. You can join us at any time. We'd love to have you. So today, my goal, as I said, my topic today was to talk about ergonomic training, and I really want to focus on capitalizing. How do we use this training to really, to its fullest advantage, right? We're not just checking a box. We're not just training people for the sake of training. We want to be training with goals and purpose in mind and taking the most or getting the most that we possibly can out of these sessions that we're offering. So I will highlight some of the key stakeholders I think could or should be trained in your organization. And then I'm going to focus on some best practice training strategies and some action-oriented or sort of future planning items that I think you could be considering as you start to build out your sessions or your plan on what training might look like at your organization. So without further ado, let's chat about the stakeholders, because I think this is an interesting starting point. Who do we want to be training at our organization? I think it's a multifold approach. I mean, I think the basic, straightforward answer is that we want to train everyone. Everyone ideally should have sort of a base level ergonomic knowledge. But then from there, I think we certainly can, take it in different directions depending on which type of stakeholder we're talking about, right? Every different individual in your organization has different needs or purpose or how they might use this information. And so the training isn't really one size fits all for every job, every task, sort of every level of your organization. There are certainly some workers that need more applied, hands-on, perhaps some that are more theoretical based, some that need accident investigation, how to investigate ergonomic injuries. Some people need something very different. And so I think all these different workers need this base level, but then we need to sort of tailor or tinker the rest of the pieces to really make sure that we are speaking to them so that the content is as applicable and makes as much sense in their day-to-day practice. Because that's ultimately the goal, I think, right? We want we want every training to resonate with the person that's receiving it. We want them to understand how they're going to be able to use this knowledge and this information to do their job in a better, more practical way. And so hopefully the sort of things I'm going to map out will help sort of guide your thinking on how you might tackle that moving forwards. So I think no surprise, the first group I want to talk about today, and certainly one I have many examples of as we go forwards in the training, is I want to talk about frontline workers. These are obviously your staff that are performing the work on the production floor, in the, your nurses in the healthcare facility. These are your office workers, right? This is the staff that are sort of boots on the ground doing the tasks on a daily basis. Generally speaking, most of these workers are going to need some sort of base knowledge, right? They're probably not bringing a ton of ergonomic awareness. They're not in health and safety. They don't have this extensive background. They're going to need to start with what is ergonomics? And I would sort of venture to add to that really one of the most important pieces, or I would say biggest hurdles we deal with when we deliver these trainings to frontline staff, is this sort of conversation around how does ergonomics apply to me, right? How does this actually, I often start a training session by asking people, like, when you hear the word ergonomics, what did you imagine you were coming to a session about? What did you picture, right? And so I still get, for every type of worker, still one of the number one answers are like office workstation, chairs, right? Those are the sort of common responses, right? They pictured me teaching them how to set up their chair. But some of these workers look like these folks in the picture right here, right? They're wearing hard hats. They're on a production floor. They are not really office-based workers. They may have 10% of their job to set up a machine or to run a report or conduct an assessment, a basic assessment of sort of troubleshooting what's going on with the machine or equipment. but they're not using a computer in the way your office administrative staff are. So ergonomics for them isn't really about a chair. It's not really about a workstation, like a computer workstation. It's about much more than that. And so I often find that as our biggest hurdle is, yes, we need to talk about what is ergonomics, but part of that conversation needs to be, how does this apply to me in my job? And sometimes that opens up their eyes to the idea that, oh, ergonomics actually, does fit for me. I'm not just going to talk about chairs. I can see how this actually applies to the work I do every day. And that can be a really valuable starting point to get some buy-in and some interest in the topic, and hopefully get them listening and attending a little bit more to some of the content, because they'll understand from the get-go how this applies to me. Part of this training is going to be talking about things like signs and symptoms. What are we watching for? What types of discomforts might you be experiencing if you are, exposed to or potentially experiencing ergonomic related injury or a musculoskeletal disorder injury, which is what an MSD stands for. So you certainly want to be talking about signs and symptoms. This will hit home for some of your workers, right? That they will be experiencing some of these things, or they'll understand in a more intimate way what this might feel like for them if they've experienced an injury in the past, potentially. But certainly want to connect it back to how they are feeling. But then I think we need to get into this other side, right? What are the workplace hazards that we're looking for, right? So we're usually talking about things like your typical, your awkward postures, your static work, your force, your repetition, and then some of the sort of compounding factors like vibration, contact stress, and those kinds of pieces, right? So we want them to understand what the hazards are in the jobs that they are doing potentially. This is also a good part of your health and safety practice, right? Is to educate workers on the hazards that are present in their jobs. Ergonomic injuries are likely present in almost every job, but we don't always do a great job of educating our staff on what those hazards are. And then ultimately, sort of the second part of that for me, which will come up in one of my points in a second, is that once they know what their hazards are, we also need to talk about what they can be doing as individuals performing the work in order to protect their bodies from that injury, right? So what are their mitigation strategies? How are they moving that's going to manage or hopefully minimize the injury risk potential? I also have on here, I think we need to talk about the importance of early reporting, right? Depending on your workplace and the type, that sometimes it's an age thing, sometimes it's a language barrier, cultural thing, but we aren't always doing a great job of opening the door for early reporting and discussion about ergonomic related injuries. And early reporting is really where we have the best opportunity to make change, right? Chances are good this is not a WSIB injury. We're not likely completing a Form 7. We're not starting the accommodation process here. Someone is telling you that on a scale of 1 to 10, 2 out of 10, they've got some wrist discomfort on occasion, right? It's not stopping them from work. It's not necessarily preventing them from doing the task that they're assigned, but they're not feeling 100% while they're doing it, right? And this is a great time to gather that information, because it gives us an opportunity to move forwards with making change that typically, if it's early on in the discomfort process, it often is a quicker recovery time. So a simple change can, or a significant one, can often prevent that discomfort from going a 2 out of 10 to a 6 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10, right? We don't want to see it progress in any way. Our frontline workers need those injury prevention strategies. I love this conversation with frontline workers. Yes, there are things that our employers should be doing, right? Our employers should be making change to tools, equipment, to workflow, to layout, to workstation heights, to all kinds of other pieces to try and minimize injury risk for the areas that we identify. But in our internal responsibility system, our workers also have a role to play, right? They also need to be choosing to keep themselves safe. And so that comes through here, right? Understanding injury prevention strategies. What can they be doing while they're at work to minimize their risk of injury? So we want to be talking about that with this group as well. The next key stakeholder that I want to highlight here is your supervisors. And I think, again, I'm going to sort of skim through some of the pieces because I've already talked about them, because there is a lot of overlap with the basics of what each group is going to need. But I think your supervisors need the sort of introduction of what is ergonomics, right? Let's make sure we understand, have a baseline knowledge of what ergonomics is. What are these signs and symptoms that your staff may be reporting to you in terms of, are they telling you they have those 2 out of 10 discomfort in their wrist? we as supervisors should be starting to take action when we get that information, right? They are sharing valuable information with us. We need to be taking steps to mitigate or manage that injury potential, right? So what are some, things that they are going to talk about? What are some of your things you're going to hear that your staff are saying that might flag you that it's time to start, looking into some potential changes that you could be making to their job, to their tasks, to the rotation? There's lots of opportunity here, but as we identify these early on, we can make those changes very quickly and hopefully get that 2 down to a 1 down to a 0 rather than a 2 to a 6 to a 10, right? I also think your supervisors need to be identifying hazards, right? That's part of their role and responsibility. So we need to help them with the workplace hazard identification. So what are we looking for? What are those force hazards? What are those posture hazards? What are those vibration hazards that are present in the work their staff are doing? And we need to be identifying those and then look, basically doing very simple risk assessment strategies like, are we all in agreement about what that looks like? Are we all in agreement that this is a concern? And oftentimes we are, right? It's very common. I was actually at a conference the last couple of days and I met several people. One of my number one questions for folks is, if you could rhyme off the top 2 or 3 jobs in your workplace that you're concerned about from an ergonomic perspective, that you or your staff or your supervisors would say, this is my number one most physical job. Almost always we can come up with those jobs and tasks, right? So as a result of that, we often also have some sense as to what the hazards are and or what the potential risk is, right? We know that there's a heavy lifting in that job. That's why we're concerned about it, right? So very likely lifting is one of your hazards. Very likely, with some basic agreement that we could probably agree on the fact that lifting is likely a moderate to high risk hazard. And it would be, warrant us investigating how we might be able to change that. And maybe you're already on the process to doing that, even depending on where you're at in the change process, right? But some basic risk assessments. Then we want to talk about injury prevention and controls, right? Actually making sure that we're preventing these injuries by looking into those solutions that we can potentially employ to minimize our injury risk. But I think your supervisors also need some additional pieces, specifically some accident investigation training, not just training in general, but accident investigation for ergonomic injuries or MSDs often looks a little bit different than other health and safety hazards. You may follow the same process, but how an ergonomic injury comes to be is often a lot more complicated than a slip, trip, fall, right? A slip, trip, fall, I'm identifying what they fell over, why was it out? I'm sort of drilling down to the root cause of how it came to be there that, led to this injury. But an ergonomic injury is often not that, right? I don't have such a clear-cut beginning to the injury. It's not that they tripped over something. It's something that's been building up over the last 6 or 8 weeks. And, they feel it when they're doing tasks A, B, C, and D. So, there's 4 potential concerns there. And it's worse when maybe they're doing this task and maybe they've been managing it actually for a lot longer than 6 weeks, but it really just flared up 6 weeks ago. And you can have these sort of very complicated conversations. And so helping our supervisors drill down on those accident investigations, hopefully so that it leads sort of backstepping to my previous point to that injury prevention and control strategy is important. And then going along with that injury reporting, right? How do we open the door to gather that information that our staff are, likely experiencing some discomforts? How are we gathering that? How are we, reporting those injuries? How are we using and, making change based on that information that we're getting? So what are trends are we seeing? How are we, making the most out of that information that we can? Right, so that's our supervisor group. I think your joint health and safety committees also need some training. Same basics here as the other ones, right? We need to understand what is ergonomic, signs and symptoms of these injuries, workplace hazard identification for sure, right? Probably also some basic risk assessment strategies. We all need to agree that these hazards are potentially risky in order to warrant moving forwards on making change, right? So those injury prevention and control, you'll notice this sounds very similar to our supervisor session. It also probably, I don't think I have it up here on the slide, but we could also probably look at accident investigation if they're, your joint health and safety committee is likely involved in that as well. So accident or incident investigation. And then also your, I actually don't have it up here, but I think one of the things I wanted to highlight just with our joint health and safety committees is ergonomics is I would say overall, anecdotally, based on the committees we work with and the organizations that we're called in to do kind of this training for, is that Joint Health and Safety Committee's mandate is to inspect buildings. Right, depending on the type of work you do, all of your work may occur in a building, right? And that might be totally fine. But for our construction type folks or our municipalities with public works or roads operators or other industries like that, where your work is actually not physically occurring in a building, right? Or even your like tradespeople who are going out on site, right? It's not occurring at your building, but your Joint Health and Safety Committee is inspecting your building. And so one of the gaps we often find is that we're not always doing a great job of capturing ergonomics in those types of work environments because the work isn't occurring in a way that I can see it, right? I can't watch and understand what's happening and look for potential risk in these jobs or tasks because the jobs or tasks are not occurring in the building that my Joint Health and Safety Committee is inspecting. So we see them doing a great job with things like exits and lighting and fire protection and slip, trip, falls hazards. They're doing amazing, but they can't see the work. And we need to watch workers do the work to understand the risks present in the job. And so sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect in what the committee can easily see and identify. And so that's something that, we're often encouraging our committees with work like that to think a little bit about how are we going to tackle this for those jobs or those tasks that aren't occurring in a facility that I'm inspecting. Okay. The other group I want to highlight before I jump into some best practices here is our engineering team. Depending on what your workplace, you may or may not have an engineering team, but if you do, this is an interesting group to apply ergonomics training to or generate ergonomics training for, I guess I should say. This group needs similar things to some of the previous sessions, right? They still need to understand what ergonomics is and how it applies to the work that's occurring in your environment, and then what their role is going to be with respect to that. They likely need to understand some basics about signs and symptoms, about hazard identification, and then they certainly need to be able to evaluate injury risk. If they are responsible for things like maybe designing a new piece of equipment, maybe bringing in a new assembly line or new production cell, right? Anything where they are, going to be tasked with actually creating, installing, or being involved with a contractor who is doing those things and providing feedback on, they need to be able to understand how the human, your worker, is going to be in on this process, right? What is your worker going to do in this production cell? What is their movement going to look like? How high are they going to need to reach? How far are they going to need to reach? How often is that going to happen? How is maintenance staff going to access it if they need to change out tooling or something else in the background, right? We need to understand the process, and your engineering team has a really unique or interesting opportunity to potentially design out ergonomic injury potential, right? So if they can catch things that are of concern about a working height being too high or too low, or reach being too far, or the layout or the flow not making sense, right? It's not going from A to B to C, it's going from A to C to B to D, and people are hopping all over the place. That's wasted time, wasted energy, increased movement. And so our engineering team can do a really great job of capturing some of those pieces in the design phase, hopefully getting them early enough that they can be designed out so that when this new piece of equipment, assembly line, cell, et cetera, arrives on site, hopefully we have managed some of our injury risk potential or lowered it because we've addressed it before it's actually even arrived, right? During the design and the build phase. And we've seen some cool things. This can be done not only with engineers, I think, they're certainly the driving force, but there's probably some element with procurement built in here as well, right? I could have said we could train our procurement team too. That's not always very practical, but even somebody writing an RFP or an RFQ for a new dump truck or a new piece of heavy equipment, right? What do we want to see in that equipment so that we are giving our staff the best opportunity to, adjust the seat, for example, in the driver's seat to best fit them, right? That's a procurement thing. We need to get the trucks in that actually have adjustability, not necessarily getting the base level seat, which doesn't do very much and is not going to allow them to properly support their body for the, 6-8 hours, if we're talking about snow plows up to 10 or 12 hours that we are in the vehicle, right? So there's even a procurement piece could be built in here as well, although I didn't highlight that team. So that's just a quick overview of what I think probably the key elements for each group I would recommend that you're thinking about training on. I think you could sort of expand that even further and add elements in depending on the level. Your engineering team could be conducting actual risk assessments if they are, ready and capable and have the time to take on that level of assessment. But if not, some basic assessment strategies would be a good place to start. Certainly having them consider, through checklists and other things, ergonomics as part of their design. Now I want to jump in to chat a little bit about best practices in our training sessions, because I think that's probably really what we're here to think a little bit more about. So when we talk about ergonomics in general, one of the sort of number one things that has come out of a bunch of research over the last 10 or 15 years, maybe even longer, to be honest, is the idea of participatory ergonomics, right? Is that the best ergonomic practices, the best ergonomic solutions often come from including a whole variety of workers in our change making or our solution process. Is that if we can incorporate as much of a variety of workers as possible, they're going to look at it from all different angles and ask all different kinds of questions, right? Some of the coolest projects we've been involved in, one was a design project I did with a team who was building a new lift assist, a very custom, very unique lift assist to do something that only their work site is likely to do in Canada. And so there was no lift assist design for this piece of equipment. So they were working with an engineering team offsite engineering team in order to build, design, and execute it. And it was a really cool team to be part of, right? They had me in there doing some of the more ergonomic expertise. They had actual staff in there who do the job, that were providing input on some of the challenges they were seeing or could foresee. They actually built a mock-up or a demo, and we were on site taking a look at it. And it was a really cool way to have a whole bunch of different folks involved in the process, right? You had your internal engineering team, your external engineering team, your ergo experts, you had your frontline staff there who actually do the work, all bringing different perspectives to the table. And so we quickly identified some key issues, right? The workers were like, I don't think this is going to move smoothly or well enough. They have like a tight corner they need to maneuver around. And they're like, I don't think it's going to get around that tight corner. And so they started to play and mock it up and try it out to figure out if they could actually make that turn, within the demonstration space they had. And the answer was maybe, but it was going to be difficult, right? And that was going to be a barrier to them successfully using it. So, the challenge was for the engineering team to go back to the drawing board and think about it a little more, see if there was a different way to I'm not an engineer, I don't build it, but a different way to have it controlled so that it could move more smoothly and more easily around the corner that they needed to navigate, right? I'm looking at it thinking, okay, I think there's some limitations to the height ranges that this works in, right? We need it to actually move through quite a range of height. At the very top, your smaller workers are going to have their hands way over their head in order to do this. Some of your taller workers are going to be knee level or close to it in order to go down to the low end. And it also had the most complicated control system I've ever seen in a lift assist. There's multiple buttons on two different handles. You have to press one here and one here. There was a lot going on, and there was multiple different combinations. A on this side plus B, plus 2 on this side did one thing, but A plus 3 did something else, and A plus 4 did something else, and then B plus 2 did something. And so you can imagine how complicated from a cognitive ergonomic perspective this came to be very quickly. And so we were bringing that to the table and challenging them to think about how they were, creating the controls and how that was going to potentially, minimize error risk and therefore injury risk potential if we can do this a little bit differently, right? So going back through several iterations, but it was cool to be part of this group that was coming at it from all kinds of different angles. And the advantage that the workplace got is they got a lift assist in the end that sort of, for the most part, addressed all of these different pieces, right? Without me there, they wouldn't have been thinking about the complexity of the controls or the spacing on the controls. Without the, the actual frontline staff there, they wouldn't have been thinking about how it moved. The, internal, project manager is also an engineer, and he's talking about some of the mechanics and the space issues and where they're going to actually build the arms and things that go along with that. And so how that's going to impact how the workers need it to use it. There was a lot of different nuances happening. So I think always starting ergonomic projects and ergonomic training with this idea that we all need to be involved. And so we all need to be, bring this base knowledge to the table and be invited to present our concerns. I often also joke that many people do ergonomic change, but don't call it ergonomics, right? You've never thought about the fact that you change that lift assist and it needed to be done. You wanted to make it easier for staff to handle it, but no one ever necessarily labeled as an ergonomic solution, but it is, right? And so when we talk about some of these pieces, you can incorporate that sort of concept in there, is that there's a lot more to ergonomics sometimes than we necessarily have branded as ergonomics in our organization. Right? But if we can bring that knowledge to the workers and then bring them into projects where you've sort of let them loose with some of this information, they have some basic understanding. Now they can use that to their advantage to provide concrete, logical, ergonomic, grounded in ergonomic hazard identification sort of pieces, bring that to a team project, right? Which is kind of a great way to get a lot of people involved and hopefully get a much better end product or end result. Plus great buy-in, right? Because they've used it, they've tried it, they understand it, they've had a chance to give feedback to it, they're happier with the outcome, they're selling it to their team who maybe wasn't there, right? The workers that didn't get to participate, but that base foundational ergonomic knowledge that they've been given will help them apply that content to this discussion. Oh, I think I highlighted this a little bit on my previous, just in my talking on my previous slide, right? Ensuring worker participation in the process is important, and it does need to include a whole variety of people, right? So your engineers, your frontline staff, probably supervisor representatives, potentially project managers, maybe health and safety folks, maybe an ergo team member. There could be all kinds of pieces involved in a project team, or even just building an ergonomic team to tackle ergonomics in-house. Those things can all sort of come, we want to have a nice, well-rounded, robust team, because that brings a lot of different perspectives to the table. I would also just want to highlight that we want to make sure that we're giving clear goals and objectives and purpose to the team that we're creating, right? So in my example, there was a very clear project-based purpose or intent, right? They were involved in the design, the discussion about what they needed. They were involved in the actual testing and practice at the engineering facility. They were involved in the testing once it actually arrived on site and the feedback process there and making adjustments and testing it out. They also were involved in sort of educating some of the other staff on how to use it because they had more knowledge and expertise. So, we want to have a very clear purpose to all of those teams that we're bringing together so that they have a very clear understanding of what their goal and objective is in the process. So I think participatory ergonomics will sort of be a theme that you'll see throughout several of the other examples that I'm going to talk about here. But the idea that multiple workers need to be trained so that they can bring their ergonomic knowledge and thoughts to the table is a super important part of every ergonomic prevention, every MSD prevention program, but certainly every project that you want to tackle related to ergonomics. In terms of the content we're delivering, I think probably one of the number one things that we're focused on whenever we deliver training and what we encourage our clients to be really thinking about hard is the idea that our content needs to be as applied as possible, right? Our workers need to sink their teeth into content that makes sense for them, that they can see how they're going to implement tomorrow in their job when they go back to work, right? Theoretical content that doesn't necessarily apply to them, or they don't see that direct connection, is going to be in one ear out the other, right? They don't have a direct application, so it's hard to hold on to that material. That's just like good teaching and learning practices, right? And this applies to all the different groups that we're going to talk about. And I'll give you some examples of how this training, I think your training could or should include some of that applied content. But it is a really important piece. If they can't touch it, feel it, make sense for their specific job, it's very difficult to hold on to your content, right? So we want to make sure that they're taking away as much information as possible. Making it applied helps that happen. So one of the things to think about, I sort of talked about our engineers as our last group here. I think this is an example of your engineering team training really needs to be grounded in practical examples, right? So this can be lots of different things, right? We're actually about to embark on a training with an engineering team who doesn't necessarily have a specific project in mind, but they're tasked with doing some safety assessments at their workplaces for various, they sort of various elements, but engineering elements, but they're going to be doing some safety pieces of this assessment. And one of our training, the training we're building for them, is very custom, very applied, because we're going to be teaching them how to use the checklist that they are going to be, walking around with and doing these safety assessments as part of their a broader engineering initiative. But their safety piece is trying to capture ergonomic concerns within the jobs that they're performing, in order to then hopefully, sort of from an engineering perspective, start to look at ways that they might solve some of the issues they're identifying. But they are actually going to be physically walking around with this checklist, which will be brand new. It's something that they're not skilled at. It's something that they haven't historically done at their workplace. So setting them up for success by helping them understand what is ergonomics, how does it apply to the jobs that we're doing, what types of hazards are we looking for, are our main concerns, and then sort of taking all that base information and pulling up this checklist and being like, okay, let's get into this. Let's get out on the floor. Let's actually complete some of these so that you're leaving with some work done, which is always great, right? You feel like you're very applied and moving forwards because you've already checked off a few boxes. But also, how do we make sure we're capturing all the information that we need to and filling out this form in a way that's going to make it very usable in the long run, right? When you go back to your desk and you sit down to actually start working through some of the things that have been identified, hopefully you will have been trained well on how to complete the form, so you've got all the information or as much of the information you need in order to start that process of evaluating, prioritizing jobs and tasks for change, and working through all these pieces. Right. The hope in this group specifically is that they'll be able to identify some of these key concerns so that they can work on, maybe not designing it out, but designing it out retroactively, right? It's already on site. Now we've got some issues. We've identified them. We're going to sort of tackle it from an engineering perspective. Let's work on how we're going to make change. This could also be done on a proactive side, right? Like my example before, right? We're building a new piece of equipment. We've got our engineering team involved in the design. Ideally, they even have some kind of checklist or something like a workflow that they are, going through every time they're building a new lift assist, they're bringing a new line in site, that new cell is coming, that new workstation's arriving. Before it's on site, they should ideally have to go through an ergonomic review process and sign off to say, yes, we've sort of looked at this from an ergonomic perspective. We don't see reaching outside these ranges. Working heights are within these ranges. Manual handling, lifting expectations don't exceed X amount of weight. We've got a whole sort of key criteria set up that they need to evaluate and review as part of their process to make sure that before that piece of equipment comes on site, they've tackled as many of the ergonomic concerns as possible. But all of that, successfully completing that checklist, has to begin with training, right? It needs to, I mean, maybe you're sitting there right now thinking, you know what, our engineers have training on ergonomics, right? Like, let's be real, they probably took some ergonomic training in university or, when they were getting their degree. And the reality is that probably they do, right? Depending on the type of engineer it is, very likely they have some level of ergonomic training in terms of like a course or two, but that's generally all it is. Most engineers aren't getting a ton of human factors training or education, I should say, as part of a degree. They might have a course, they might have half a course, or it might be embedded into a few courses, but they're not getting a lot of highly specific, focused ergonomic or human factors education. And so taking the time to build that in now is definitely worthwhile from a prevention perspective if you can get to the design it out stage, but certainly even as a reactive perspective, helping them see the concerns that are bringing brought forward, and then helping them see what strategies would make sense or where are those likely going to be your biggest pain points, and then hopefully be able to come up with strategies and ideas on how they can make change to reduce the risk. I also think your content needs to be applied in other ways, right? Depending on what work you're doing with your engineering team, you could be doing videos, you could be doing pictures. I would also encourage you to get out on the floor with them, especially if you have a new checklist that you're trying to train them on or something you want them to incorporate into their practice. If there's any kind of formal paperwork to complete, you want them to actually complete it while they're there with the ergonomist going through the education piece, understanding how all these hazards we've been identifying are going to get translated into this form, and then how I'm going to use that information to actually move forwards with their piece of the job or their key piece of the job, which is that change making process, right? When we're talking about our frontline staff, our supervisors, our committee members, we may be able to get out on the floor and do some training, which is always amazing. I love when that happens. It's always great. It may not be practical depending on the work that you do, but ideally we are at least watching pictures, we're at least seeing pictures of people performing the work when I'm demonstrating examples of the hazards that I'm talking about. I want to show someone in my workplace lifting something, right? When I'm talking about lifting hazards, I want to show someone in my workplace in an awkward back posture when I'm talking about postures, or in an awkward shoulder position, reaching forwards, reaching up, doing something that is non-neutral with my body so that they can see unequivocally that these are happening in their workplace. Because you know what, that's Joe, and I know that Joe does X, Y, and Z. So I've seen him do this task 100 times. So you're right, lifting is a part of our jobs, right? Because I can identify that I have done that, or I see my colleague do that every day, right? So that really brings home the fact that these hazards are present because I can see it, right? I'm looking at it. We are clearly doing that work because it is right in front of me. Same is true with video. It's a bit more dynamic. You get a lot more opportunity to do some more conversational based small group sessions because there's more to bite and but to dig into there, right? Likely in a video, you'll see multiple hazards. You'll see your lifting hazards or carrying hazards. You see a push pull hazard. You'll see a lifting hazard, or excuse me, a posture hazard. Maybe you'll see someone reaching forwards. It's good to go through that so they can see the dynamic element of hazards as well, right? That as people are moving, how they're combining hazards. So you're lifting, but you're lifting in a terrible posture, right? And so how does that sort of compound the problem? And then sort of the reverse is also true. That discussion about mitigation strategies is eliminating one half of that also helps to solve that issue, right? Just because we're lifting doesn't mean it's a problem. It's when it might, right, if it's really heavy, but if we're lifting in excellent posture, we can often lift quite a bit more weight than if we're lifting in terrible posture. And so sometimes that depends on where it's lifted from or what body mechanics I'm using while I'm going into that movement. And you can help to have that conversation because you're seeing something very dynamic. You're seeing the movement, the posture that's going along with the heavy lifting, the pushing, pulling, the carrying, etc. Right. So really making that content applicable so that your staff are really sort of identifying and feeling like they're seeing the hazards or getting a better understanding of how this work applies. How does ergonomics apply to me? Oh, well, I do that. So therefore, obviously, it applies to me because Jen has just said that's one of the hazards. I can see myself doing that. What are the next steps, hopefully. And that's the sort of piece that goes along with this is we apply the content and then we have discussion, hopefully, about how are we going to mitigate that risk, right? So in that video, you observed someone lifting from below their knee with mediocre back posture and something very heavy, et cetera, et cetera. How could they have, this is the great opportunity for your frontline staff, how could you as a worker have made different choices, right? What are the options you had as a worker to do that task more safely, right? To lift better. And so then you can have discussions about safe lifting, right? That you're talking about, oh, they could have stepped closer to the load. They could have walked around the skid rather than reached across. They could have slid it towards them before they lifted it, for example. Oh, it might have been better if they put one hand under this side rather than balanced left and right. The load isn't actually balanced. So it's probably better if they actually hold one hand further out and one hand closer so that they can sort of more centralize the load or the weight of that object. There's lots of discussion and great sort of conversation that happens as part of within your workers' control. What realm of responsibility do they have? What can they do to prevent injuries in the work that, the tasks that we're observing as part of our training session? So I always love those really applied practical components. We can get out on the floor and we can see them. If you can get people touching things, right? You want to do safe lifting training. Best way to do that is to get some objects your staff actually move and lift, and then do it, right? Actually get them out there practicing, giving them feedback, very, very specific. Oh, look, I have a spelling mistake on my slide. I missed an I when I was spelling there. So it should say get specific, but essentially this is an example of where it's not specific, right? This is the starting point. We see this a lot, some safe lifting training, right? So it's got all the key elements there, right? I haven't read all the details, but it'll say, feet shoulder width apart, keep the load close to your body, lift with your legs, not with your back, keep your back straight, yada, yada, right? It's got all the key bullet points up there on the slide. However, there are piles and piles and piles of people in this world that do a lot of lifting in their job, but very rarely lift a box, right? And so what they're looking at right now is someone lifting a box. It works great if you lift a box. If you don't, there's a lot of other variables that sometimes make it very difficult to maintain this specific posture, right? If you're lifting something that is non-standard, so even a box, but something that's long, right? Now it's different. You're not going to lift that the same way. If you try and keep your hands really tight, the box is going to be super tippy, and you're actually going to do a ton of core work in order to stabilize the load. So you're going to widen your hands for someone who is lifting something very long, potentially. You are going to have something, let's say you're lifting tools and equipment, right? You're lifting a concrete saw off the ground. Well, that's a whole other level, because there isn't really handholds like you're going to see on the box, right? There's not even a way to grip it underneath. You wouldn't do that. The blade would be in the way. You're going to hold it by its handles, but one handle's higher than the other. They're in odd positions. They may or may not be really the handles are more designed for the use of the tool, not necessarily the lifting and carrying of the tool after. So sometimes what we see is they don't necessarily create like a balanced load for someone who is lifting and carrying that item. So there's a lot of discussion that can happen about how do we take this information, which is good and valuable, and it's all grounded in safe lifting principles, but how do we apply these safe lifting principles to all of our non-standard lifts? And that's how you get specific, right? You start presenting all these odd, unusual, weirdly shaped, heavy, awkward places to get in and out of, right? They don't have full access to that item, right? It's tucked underneath like a racking in a warehouse. Maybe they have to reach over a lift assist. Maybe they're putting it on a skid and it's too far in front. They can't lift it well. They're not allowed to stand on the skid because that's a safety concern. There's a lot of pieces that we can start to play with and discuss, and hopefully take these safe lifting principles, which are valuable, but not helpful if you don't lift a box, right? If your object is different, now it's not very specific and it's not totally applicable to your job. And I've seen that. I don't know if you've ever seen that. Countless times I've gone into listen to a safe lifting training, and you can watch the team who's listening glaze over, right? At the 10-minute mark, they're glazing over because the video that they're watching is showing them safe lifting practices. They're lifting a box from a decent height. They're showing how to use your legs, keep your back straight, blah, blah. But these workers don't lift any of those. They don't lift a box, right? That's not remotely part of their job. And so they're like, well, I don't do that. So there's really no point in me paying attention. And so we lose the value of that training because it's not specific to the work that they're doing. So really drilling down and talking and, presenting solutions and practical applied content that is highly specific to the work that they're doing is super valuable in helping them understand and apply the content, so that hopefully we're preventing injuries because they're making better choices, that they understand how to apply these principles to their specific work, henceforth hopefully helping them make better choices. We even see this in things like office training, right? So very specific training, ideal is to actually show them the equipment they're using, right? Generic office ergonomic training is fine, right? The principles are all the same. That doesn't change. You still want your keyboard and mouse at a certain height. You still want your chair to be supporting you in a certain way. You still want your monitors at a certain height. But if people are looking at this video and it's showing them how to adjust a keyboard tray in order to type and mouse at the right height, and they do not have a keyboard tray at their desk, we've lost them, right? Because it's not clear for that individual how they are going to achieve the principle that we have mapped out, right? We've said you want you to type and mouse at elbow height, lower your keyboard to get to elbow height, and they're like, I don't have a keyboard, so what do I do now, right? And that lack of specificity is going to cause gaps in your training, right? They're not going to be able to successfully execute what you're hoping they are getting from the session in the day-to-day jobs, because it's not sort of equipping them with the information they need for the task they're performing. We also have done some really cool trainings in the last, this one was actually about 1.5 years ago, I think, maybe 2 years ago. One of my colleagues, Alex, went in and did a very detailed project with one of our local manufacturers, and it was highly specific. And this is not related to a Ministry of Labor order, I don't think, but one of the other, we have seen some Ministry of Labor orders coming through that related to training, right? If they're related to training, one of the things that we are seeing in some of the language of those orders is that you need to make your training specific and detailed, or task specific, or unique to the tasks and hazards that are being, the hazards that are being performed at your work, or that you're experiencing at your work. So this is an example of how, we got really specific with the training, right? Alex was in visiting this client. She did some risk assessments for them. She was doing some other pieces of the project, but part of that was all a lead up to building out a video-based training that they could use to make it sustainable. They could watch it over and over and over again. Every new hire being onboarded could see this training, but it was very specific. It had like your top 5 principles for, ergonomic injury prevention. I forgot the exact terminology because it wasn't my project, but essentially Alex went through and looked at work methods she'd seen on all these different jobs and tasks, and sort of categorized them into key things that she thought they could change with better work practices, right? So this wasn't necessarily engineering changes. It wasn't changing tools and equipment. Is what do we want our employees to know about how to perform their work safely from a postural, from an ergonomic injury prevention sort of standpoint, right? What are we coming in at? So one of the things in this example was elbow height. So, bending over and placing your hand at the side, and up the, in this case, some cardboard, actually resulted in leaning forwards and reaching, which was not great for the shoulder or the back. But by placing your hands in a different position, it allowed you to stay more upright, which instantly helped with your shoulder and back posture. Right. So she had 5 examples, I believe, like this. One was for hands and wrists. One was for your back. One was for your shoulder. There was sort of geared to some of their key injury areas, trying to help educate their workers on the movements that are going to help prevent them from experiencing an injury while performing this work. Right. So very, very specific. These are pictures right from the plant floor, right? Production pictures that right from the plant floor. And she had 5 very specific things. Nothing was generic. It was like, how thick should the pile be that I'm grabbing? What height should I be grabbing it at? How do I, move this coil or this, bound, I forgot what she was moving. I think sheets of paper, right? Curled sheets of paper, right? How do I move those? And so there was a bunch of very, very specific examples of how to use good posture and good body mechanics to minimize injury risk. Highly specific, very cool project, designed to be ultra sustainable because they wanted to be able to use it again and again and again. So now all of their new hires see this training session as part of their onboarding process, and then as a refresher periodically at whatever intervals they've set, to try and really work on improving work method to minimize injury risk, right? A great example of super specific training. We can also do a lot of job coaching stuff. And so we can see this internally, right? You can coach your own staff, but I like to sort of highlight that job coaching often occurs when someone's new, right? They're learning to perform a new task. Maybe they're cross-training in your organization, right? But in my opinion, job coaching needs to go beyond the SOPs, right? Not just coaching on the step-by-step process of how do I do X, Y, and Z, but also the good work methods, right? This is where, we can be coaching as part of, maybe even built into our SOP, which would be a great strategy, right? Our SOP, which is sort of a training document in of itself, also incorporates movement strategies to minimize injury risk, right? So not just put part A into spot A and then part B into spot 2, right? It's about, we handle the part with a full grip, keep it close to the body, step close before you load to prevent reaching. There can be some other language and content in there that helps to provide that ergonomic education as well. And this can be reinforced during job coaching, right? Not only are you like putting part A in part, spot A, but you're also reminding your workers about good work method, right? You want to step up close. You want to minimize how much reaching. You want to avoid double handling. You don't need to pick 2 up and leave 1 sitting and then put 1 in, wait for the next cycle, then put another 1 in, because it actually adds to the gripping and handling time of the job, right? So there can be a lot of educational opportunities in that one-on-one feedback opportunity, which can come from an external party like an ergonomist, but it can also come internal with some key workers that have got this is another example of sort of train the assessor, train the trainers, right? If we can give them the tools they need to provide good feedback, movement feedback that is very specific to the work they're training on, you could often see some return on your investment there as well. All right. I think continuing education makes sense, right? The idea that we need to continue to apply this training, not just once, right? Not just our onboarding, but some sort of follow-up and systematic procedure. That's where you're going to get the best benefit, right? During onboarding, there's a lot of info coming at us. It's easy to miss some of these pieces, but if we're retraining or giving feedback as the time goes on, we should slowly see some of the good work methods sink in and hopefully be provided in that moment. I'm going to skip a couple pieces, that last slide, just because I want to talk about a couple other pieces. Some other examples that we see a lot, very popular, are train the assessor. This is an example of where train your job coachers. You can also train assessors. This is popular with our office ergonomics programs. Our clients are doing these in-house, and we're helping to train some assessors on how to conduct ergonomic assessments for those basic, sort of straightforward ergonomic assessments. Maybe it's a brand new hire. Everybody gets an ergonomic assessment. Hopefully we set them up well to start and they don't ever experience an injury. Maybe they've just presented with some sort of injury and you're trying to, manage that in-house. Usually what happens is we get involved when it gets more complicated, but we can often give a health and safety team or a few key stakeholders some really great tips and strategies for assessing things in-house before they, need an external party involved. Great cost savings if you have the capacity on your team in order to do this, because you are going to handle a bunch of things in-house before they ever become an issue that you need external support. I don't have any exact numbers on this, but I would anticipate you can handle a significant chunk of your potential ergonomic injuries by providing that one-on-one education about how to set up your equipment, adjusting equipment to fit them. You'd be amazed at how many ergonomic concerns can be addressed through just adjustments to the equipment you already have without even adding or changing it. I also wanted to highlight that tailgate talks and safety talks, which are often driven by your supervisors or are coming from your supervisors, sometimes from a safety champion or a committee member as well. But these would be great ways to also reinforce your ergonomic conversation, especially, it's not a great way necessarily to start it, but if you've already had some base training, everybody's sort of got some base level of knowledge on ergonomics. We can do these. This is great when you're doing things like maybe shifting seasonal work. So you're coming into spring or summer tasks that maybe for you are different than fall and winter tasks. A great time to reinforce some of the practices that they should be thinking about while they're shoveling, for example, what maybe they wouldn't have done that very much in the winter. Or perhaps even looking at sort of some smaller things, right? You can do a safe lifting training, but you could do a very specific one, right? Because a tailgate talk or a safety talk is only supposed to be a few minutes, or it could be longer, but it's often only a very short time. So you could use that opportunity to bring in one of your non-standard items and just talk about that one piece, right? Remember, we had that great safe lifting training. Remember these key principles. Today, I want to play with lifting this non-standard item. How are we doing that? How are we keeping our back straight throughout the process? What does that look like? Let's all get in here and put our hands on it and actually have a go at what that's going to look like for us, right? A great way to sort of reinforce that safe lifting training in a very snapshot, bite-sized way that gets someone thinking about, how do I lift this object? And that's a great sort of opportunity for a safety talk or tailgate talk, right? Quick and easy, Short, simple, because we're only looking at one very specific piece of equipment, but a great way to start some ergonomic thought and conversation about safe lifting for those non-standard items you might handle. I want to talk a little bit before we wrap up here today. I've got 5 minutes or so to go, about some next level, right? So that's all like applying things, making it very specific, right? Great strategies, super important things. But I think there are also some opportunity to take your trainings to another level, right? If really getting the most or maximizing your takeaways from this. Things I want you to think about is, what can your training do beyond just provide the education to your staff? One of the things that we sometimes pair with our trainings, depending on what our clients are trying to aim for, what their goals are, might be to use our training also as a data gathering opportunity, right? Your workers are your experts. And so if you have your frontline staff in as a captive audience in a training, you're talking about ergonomics, having them complete some sort of questionnaire as part of, as wrap up to that training, right? They got their education, they know what the hazards are. Let's do a questionnaire to discuss it. You can grab lots of information. You might do a discomfort survey, right? So question is, are you experiencing discomfort? Where in your body? And on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most, where would you rank that discomfort? It might help you see trends, right? Let's say you've got, a department and you've got 20 odd people in that department. Maybe you see a trend where a bunch of people have right shoulder discomfort on, between a 2 and an 8. Well, if you're talking like 15, 16, 17 people out of 20 have right shoulder discomfort, that's a sign that there's an issue, right? That there's a problem there with one of the tools, the equipment, the layout, the process. There's something about that job and task that is likely leading down the path to this right shoulder injury. It can be a great way to grab data that isn't necessarily driven by injury statistics, right? It's like leading indicators. These are your 2 out of 10s, right? These are your people who haven't probably reported an injury at this stage. So you don't have WSIB claims related to this, but it will identify that you do have a problem, right? A problem that you can get ahead of if you start to investigate how you might be able to make change. You can also gather some cool information about work practices. We've done this with sometimes we have workers that use very specific computer programs, for example. One of the questions we asked at one point was, tell us what computer shortcuts you use. And I was wowed by the variety of what people use. Some people had very basic ones. Some people had had a whole laundry list of things that they used. They had explored it to the nth degree and had lots of examples that they used all the time. And so we were able to use that to compile a document that we could send out to everyone saying, hey, what we learned is that you're not all using the same computer shortcuts. Here's a list of the most commonly used ones by your colleagues. We think you should explore because we think it would make your job or task easier, reduce the amount of mousing that you're doing, which would potentially address some of that right hand discomfort that we've been seeing or saw as part of our discomfort survey. Right? You can learn all kinds of information if you take the time to gather some data during these training sessions. You might even be able to use it to gather some data about people's setup, right? So when thinking about like a computer workstation, I would like to know where we potentially have some equipment issues. So I can start to ask or get people to do a bit of a self-assessment as part of this, right? I'm giving them training on education on their office ergonomic setup, and I'm asking them to tell me, were you able to work at elbow height? If the answer is yes, fabulous. I can move on because that's exactly what we're aiming for. If the answer is no, follow-up's required because we still haven't addressed all the ergonomic gaps that were present at this employee's workstation. They need a one-on-one check-in, right? They need something extra because they couldn't achieve the goal during the session, right? So sometimes you can even build some self-assessment into some of your training initiatives in certain circumstances where it makes sense, but it can be a really great way to gather data and help you identify people maybe who need some follow-up or additional support that maybe you're struggling with a task or a movement or a workstation layout issue. Ideally, all of this also leads down to creating great feedback opportunities, right? Looking at ways to give workers an opportunity to provide you with information about what they would change about their job. I often say workers are the experts, and so giving them a space to tell you what they're struggling with but just as importantly, to create opportunities for them to give you suggestions is super helpful. You'd be amazed, workers are doing this job and sometimes they're thinking about what they wish they could do differently. If they wish it was laid out a little differently, they wish they had this tool, they wish that product, flowed in a different way. And they've got all kinds of ideas because sometimes they got nothing but time to think about it. And so you can get all kinds of really cool suggestions and ideas from your workers if you give them that space to give you the feedback. So whether that's through a questionnaire, whether that's through a suggestion box, whether that's through discussion during the training session itself, where somebody's doing note taking and sort of gathering that information, you can get lots of great suggestions and ideas that you might follow up with later if you create the space for that to happen. I already talked about integrated committees because I talked about participatory ergonomics. So before I know it's 2:00. So the last thing I just want to highlight on is also to recognize successes. If you have workers who are making recommendations, who are bringing content forward, who are talking about the discomfort, sort of identifying them early, there's all kinds of potential success levels that we could be celebrating. But anytime workers are helping you successfully identify hazards and make change, celebrating that information is a great way to continually build or momentum for your ergonomic change process. So we want to celebrate all of the successes that you maybe have an opportunity for. Okay, so that's always just a great strategy. It's also, if you're looking at the MSD prevention program, it's also the last step to always celebrate your successes. That was all I had for today. I'm happy to field some questions. I didn't see any come in while the webinar was on, but I'm happy to field some questions if you have any.